divine calling. Daniel was born into a small village nestled in the rolling hills of a remote countryside. The village, a quiet and peaceful place, was known for its simplicity, with vast fields stretching far into the horizon, where farmers toiled daily under the sun. Life in the village was predictable, almost repetitive, a rhythm that many found comforting. But even from a young age, Daniel sensed that this predictable life was not for him. As a child, Daniel was quiet, often more interested in the vastness of the sky or the whispering of the wind than in the games other children played. He would sit for hours on the edge of the village, gazing at the mountains in the distance, feeling a strange pull toward them. His father would sometimes catch him in those moments, gently reminding him, "The world is larger than it seems, Daniel, but it doesn't mean it's waiting for us. Our purpose is here, in this soil." Despite his father's words, something deep inside Daniel disagreed. Growing up, Daniel's family faced their share of struggles. His parents were farmers, hardworking but often burdened by poor harvests and the demands of a life that required unrelenting labor. There were seasons when the crops failed, and the family had to scrape by with whatever they could gather. Daniel's father was a man of deep faith, and every evening, without fail, he would gather the family to pray, asking for strength and blessings from God. Yet, despite his father's devoutness, Daniel often found himself questioning the purpose of their struggles. "Why does God let us suffer so much?" he asked his mother one evening, his young face wrinkled with confusion. His mother, with her gentle smile, stroked his hair and replied, "God has his reasons, Daniel. We don't always see the bigger picture, but we must trust that he knows what he's doing." These words were meant to comfort, but they left Daniel feeling more lost than before. While his family seemed to find solace in their faith, Daniel felt a growing distance between himself and the God they prayed to each night. It wasn't that he didn't believe. No, there was something inside him that knew there was a higher power, something greater than himself. But this sense of divine purpose felt elusive, as if it were just beyond his grasp. As he grew older, Daniel tried to fit in with the life around him. He learned the ways of farming from his father, helped his mother with household chores, and attended church services every Sunday like the rest of the villagers. But while others seemed content, Daniel's heart remained restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant for something more, something beyond the routine of daily life in the village. There were moments when this restlessness became overwhelming. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering why he felt so disconnected. The other young men in the village seemed content with their futures. They would take over their family farms, marry, and raise children, just as their fathers had done before them. But when Daniel imagined this path for himself, it felt hollow, as if his soul was being pulled toward something else, something bigger, though he had no idea what it was. His yearning for a greater purpose was not something he could easily explain. It wasn't born out of dissatisfaction or a desire for wealth or recognition. Rather, it was a quiet, persistent whisper in his soul, urging him to seek more. Often, Daniel would walk alone to the edge of the village, where the fields met the forest, and there, in the silence of nature, he would try to listen for a sign, for a voice, for anything that might give him direction. But the answers never came. Daniel's isolation grew as the years passed. His friends began to distance themselves, unable to understand the storm of questions that seemed to cloud his heart. To them, life was simple. You worked, you prayed, you lived. But Daniel's mind was always somewhere else, searching for meaning in the mundane, trying to understand why he felt so separate from the world around him. Even his relationship with his faith was strained. While his father prayed with confidence and belief, Daniel found himself doubting. He would sit in church, listening to the priest's sermons, but his heart wasn't moved the way others seemed to be. The words were beautiful, but they felt distant, as if they were meant for someone else. Daniel wondered if there was something wrong with him. Why couldn't he feel the same peace that faith brought to others? One day, as he sat on a hillside overlooking the village, Daniel confided in his older brother, Jonathan, who had always been a source of wisdom in his life. Jonathan, unlike Daniel, seemed content with the simplicity of their existence. He had already begun working the fields with their father and was preparing to take over the family farm in the future. "Do you ever wonder if there's more to life than this?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan smiled, but his eyes held a hint of understanding. "We all wonder that, Daniel, at some point or another. But not everyone is meant for greatness. Some of us are just meant to live quietly, serve our families, and honor God in the small things." Daniel nodded, but remained unconvinced. It wasn't that he looked down on the quiet life of service Jonathan described. In fact, he admired it. But something inside him refused to accept that this was all there was. His heart ached for something more, a calling, a purpose that went beyond the fields, the crops, and the routines of daily life. Years passed, and Daniel grew into a young man, still haunted by the same questions. His parents, though loving, began to worry about him. He had not yet taken a wife, nor did he show much interest in settling down like the other young men of his age. The village elders whispered about him, wondering if perhaps he was destined to be a wanderer or worse, someone lost in his own thoughts forever. Yet, deep within, Daniel knew that his discontent was not a curse, but a calling. Though he could not see it, he felt that God had set something aside for him, something that would reveal itself in time. The problem was, time felt like it was slipping away, and with each passing year, the weight of his unanswered questions grew heavier. But just as Daniel was beginning to lose hope, something extraordinary happened. Something that would change his life and set him on a path he never could have imagined. In the quiet, isolated life of Daniel, a divine whisper was about to become a roar, and the purpose he had long sought was closer than he ever realized. Chapter 2: A Test of Faith. Daniel's life took an unexpected turn one cold autumn morning. The sky had been overcast for days, and the air carried a chill that seeped into every corner of the village. The crops that year had been weak, barely enough to sustain the families who depended on the land for their survival. The harvest season, usually a time of hope and preparation for the colder months, was filled with anxiety and uncertainty. But for Daniel, the true storm had yet to come. It started with a cough. His father, a man known for his strength and resilience, had been feeling unwell for a few days. At first, no one thought much of it. He was always the one to push through, to work harder when times were tough. But the cough deepened. His breaths became labored, and soon, his father could no longer rise from his bed. Daniel and his brother Jonathan worked tirelessly, hoping it was a passing illness, something he could shake off with rest. But the days turned into weeks, and their father grew weaker. One evening, as Daniel sat by his father's bedside, he felt a deep sense of helplessness wash over him. The man who had been the pillar of their family, the one who had always taught them to trust in God's plan, now lay before him, fragile and frail. His skin had taken on a pale hue, his eyes distant, as though he were already slipping away. "Father," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "why is this happening? We've prayed. We've asked God for healing, but you're only getting worse. Why isn't he listening?" His father turned his head slowly, his breath shallow. "Daniel," he rasped, his voice weak but still steady, "God is always listening, but his answers, they don't always come in the way we expect." Daniel's heart ached at these words. He had heard them before, countless times, in church sermons and from his parents. But now, in the face of such suffering, they felt hollow. He wanted to believe, but all he felt was frustration. He had prayed fervently for his father's recovery, But there was no miracle, only silence. A few days later, Daniel's father passed away. The loss hit the family hard, and though the village came together to mourn and support them, nothing could fill the void left behind. Jonathan took over the farm duties, working from dawn to dusk to keep the family afloat, while their mother, consumed by grief, withdrew into herself. And Daniel, he felt lost. The questions that had haunted him for years now seemed more pressing than ever. Daniel's grief quickly turned to anger. He had always struggled with understanding God's will, but now it felt like a cruel joke. His father had been a man of deep faith, a man who had dedicated his life to serving others and trusting in God. And yet, he had been taken from them in the cruelest of ways, leaving Daniel to wonder if God truly cared for them at all. Each night, Daniel knelt by his bed, attempting to pray, but the words wouldn't come. His heart was filled with bitterness, and his faith, already fragile, seemed to crumble with every passing day. He began to question everything: his father's teachings, the prayers they had said together, the very existence of a higher purpose. How could a loving God allow such suffering? How could he stand by and watch as good, faithful people were torn apart by loss? One evening, unable to sleep, Daniel wandered out of the house and into the fields. The air was cold, and a thin layer of frost had settled on the ground. The stars above were bright, scattered across the sky like tiny beacons of light, but Daniel felt no comfort in their presence. He looked up at the heavens, his fists clenched, and shouted into the night, "Why, God? Why would you do this to us? What have we done to deserve this pain? Where are you?" The words echoed in the stillness, but there was no answer, only the sound of the wind moving through the trees. For weeks, Daniel continued in this state of anger and despair. He distanced himself from the village, from his family, and even from his brother Jonathan, who had always been his confidant. The weight of his father's death and his own questions about faith were too much to bear. He stopped attending church, stopped praying, stopped believing that there was any meaning in the suffering they had endured. One afternoon, while working in the field alone, Daniel collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the grief and confusion that had been building inside him. The weight of his doubt was crushing, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely abandoned, not only by God, but by the very purpose he had been searching for all these years. In that moment, a thought occurred to him. Maybe there was no grand design, no divine plan. Maybe life was just a series of random events, and the faith his father had clung to so desperately had been nothing more than a comforting illusion. It was a dark thought, one that filled him with dread. Without faith, without purpose, what was the point of anything? That night, Daniel found himself once again kneeling by his bed, though this time he wasn't praying. His hands rested in his lap, his head bowed, but his heart was numb. He sat there in silence for what felt like hours, his mind swirling with doubt and confusion. And then, in the stillness of that moment, a small voice within him spoke. Not an audible voice, but a gentle whisper, a quiet urging that seemed to come from deep inside his soul. "Daniel, trust." The word hung in the air, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't a command, nor was it an answer to all of his questions. It was simply an invitation, a call to trust in something greater than himself, even if he didn't understand it. Daniel lifted his head, startled by the sudden clarity of the thought. It didn't make sense. How could he trust when everything had fallen apart? But the voice persisted, growing slightly stronger. Trust that there is a purpose in the pain. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself returning to that moment, to that simple word, trust. It wasn't an easy process. Every part of him wanted to resist, to cling to his anger and doubt. But slowly, he began to open himself to the possibility that his suffering had meaning, that perhaps his father's death was not the end of their story, but a part of something greater. One evening, after weeks of wrestling with his emotions, Daniel returned to the small chapel at the edge of the village. It was empty, the candles flickering softly in the dim light. He knelt at the altar, the place where he had once prayed so fervently for his father's healing, and this time, he didn't ask for anything. Instead, he simply spoke from the heart. God, I don't understand why this happened. I don't know why you let us suffer, or why my father had to die. But if there's a purpose in this, if you're really there, then help me to see it. Help me to trust. As the words left his lips, Daniel felt a strange peace wash over him. It wasn't a solution to his problems, nor did it erase his grief. But it was enough. It was the beginning of something new. A step toward healing, toward faith, toward understanding that sometimes suffering is not a punishment, but a test of faith. Daniel's journey was far from over. The questions and doubts would continue to surface, and the pain of losing his father would never fully leave him. But in that quiet moment of surrender, he had taken the first step toward finding his way back to God, and to the purpose he had been searching for all his life. Chapter 3. The Wisdom of the Elder. The days following Daniel's prayer at the chapel were filled with quiet reflection. The village continued its rhythm. People toiled in the fields, families gathered for meals, and life moved on. But for Daniel, everything had changed. There was a new sense of stillness within him, a fragile trust he was just beginning to nurture. His grief and questions lingered, but they no longer consumed him as they once had. Something deeper was calling him, though he didn't fully understand what it was. One morning, while tending to the fields, Daniel heard Jonathan mention that Father Thomas, the village elder and priest, had returned from a pilgrimage. Father Thomas was a man of great wisdom, a spiritual guide for many in the village. People spoke of him with reverence, for his understanding of God's ways seemed to go far beyond the typical sermons heard in church. He had been away for several months, visiting holy sites and monasteries, seeking to deepen his connection with the divine. Daniel hadn't spoken to Father Thomas in years, not since he was a child. Back then, the priest had seemed almost mystical, a man who could see through people's souls with a single glance. Now, hearing that the old priest was back, Daniel felt a strange pull to seek him out. Something inside told him that Father Thomas might hold the answers to the questions that still haunted him. The questions about his father's death, his faith, and his place in the world. The next Sunday, after the church service, Daniel lingered in the chapel as the villagers slowly filed out. Father Thomas remained at the altar, his tall frame slightly stooped with age, but his eyes still sharp and clear. Daniel approached him hesitantly, unsure of what he would say. The priest noticed him and smiled warmly, beckoning him forward. "Daniel," Father Thomas said in his deep, calming voice, "it's been a long time, hasn't it?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, Father. I didn't know if you would remember me." The priest chuckled softly. "I remember everyone, Daniel, especially those who seek truth as earnestly as you do. I can see it in your eyes. You have questions, don't you?" Daniel felt his throat tighten. He hadn't even spoken a word yet, and already Father Thomas seemed to know exactly why he was there. He nodded again, trying to find the courage to speak. "I do," Daniel began, his voice low. "I've been struggling, Father. Ever since my father died, I've been questioning everything. God, my faith, my purpose. I've been praying, but it feels like I'm not getting any answers." Father Thomas looked at him thoughtfully, then gestured for Daniel to follow him. Together, they walked out of the chapel and toward the small garden behind it, where a stone bench sat beneath an old oak tree. The priest sat down, and Daniel followed, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. "Daniel," Father Thomas began after a moment of silence, "you are not the first to wrestle with these questions. In fact, it is often through suffering and doubt that we come to understand God's purpose for us more clearly. Daniel looked at the priest, the weight of his grief and confusion still heavy in his chest. But why does it have to be this way? Why does God let us suffer? Why did he take my father when he was such a good man? Father Thomas took a deep breath, his eyes gazing out at the trees as if he were seeing something far beyond them. Your father's death was not a punishment, Daniel, nor was it meaningless. Every life, every moment of joy and pain, is part of a much larger tapestry that we cannot always see. You see, we are all threads in God's design, woven together in ways that go far beyond our understanding. The priest paused, turning to meet Daniel's gaze. Have you ever heard of the concept of the chosen ones? Daniel shook his head slowly, unsure of where this was going. Father Thomas smiled faintly. It is an ancient belief, passed down through many generations. There are some people in this world, rare souls, who are chosen by God for a specific purpose. Their lives are not easy. They face trials, losses, and challenges that others may never experience. But these tests are not meant to break them. They are meant to prepare them for the role they must play in God's plan. Daniel frowned, his heart pounding. Are you saying my father was one of them? The priest shook his head. Not your father, Daniel. You. Daniel stared at him, his mind reeling. Me? How could I be one of these chosen ones? I've doubted God. I've been angry with him. How could I be chosen for anything? Father Thomas's eyes softened with understanding. The chosen ones are not perfect, Daniel. They are not saints, free from doubt or anger. In fact, their struggles often bring them closer to God. For it is in those moments of doubt that they learn to trust more deeply. You are questioning, yes, but you are also seeking. And that is what makes you different. Daniel shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. But what am I chosen for? What's the purpose of all this pain? Father Thomas leaned forward, his voice lowering as if sharing a great secret. You are chosen to be a light, Daniel, a beacon for others who are lost in their own suffering. You've already begun the journey, even if you don't realize it. The loss of your father, the doubts you've carried, it's all been shaping you, molding you into someone who can help others find their way back to God. Daniel was silent, the words sinking in. He thought back to the weeks of anger and confusion, the nights spent questioning everything. Could it really be true that all of that had been part of a divine plan? Father, Daniel said slowly, if I'm chosen for this, why do I still feel so lost? Why does it still hurt so much? Father Thomas nodded, his expression serious. Being chosen does not mean that the pain goes away. It means that you learn to carry it with grace, knowing that it serves a purpose. You are not meant to have all the answers right now, Daniel, but you are meant to trust that, in time, they will come. The priest stood up, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. God does not abandon his chosen ones, Daniel. He walks with them, even in their darkest moments. And when the time is right, he reveals their path. You are still in the midst of your journey, but I promise you this. If you continue to seek him, if you continue to trust, even when it's hard, you will see the purpose behind it all. Daniel looked up at Father Thomas, the weight of his words settling deep in his heart. He still didn't understand everything, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Hope that his suffering wasn't in vain. Hope that there was a greater plan at work. As they walked back to the chapel, Father Thomas spoke again, his voice soft but firm. Remember, Daniel, the chosen ones are not those who are free from struggle. They are the ones who, in the midst of their struggle, continue to seek God. And that is what you are doing. Daniel nodded, feeling the truth of the priest's words resonate within him. He wasn't alone. He never had been. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew now that he was walking it for a reason. As he left the chapel that day, Daniel felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He would continue to seek answers, to trust, and to believe that, in time, God would reveal his plan. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Daniel felt that he was no longer walking it blindly. He was chosen, and he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Chapter 4: Embracing the Journey. The days that followed Daniel's conversation with Father Thomas marked the beginning of a profound transformation. Though he still felt the weight of grief and uncertainty, something inside him had shifted. He no longer saw his pain as an endless void, but as part of a greater journey. He understood that while he didn't have all the answers, he was being shaped, molded by divine hands for a purpose he was only beginning to comprehend. One early morning, after a restless night, Daniel found himself walking through the village. The air was crisp, the sun just beginning to rise over the hills, casting a soft glow on the world below. He stopped for a moment to take in the scene. Children laughing as they ran across the fields, an old woman tending to her garden, a young couple chatting quietly by the market. Life continued around him, unaware of the battles that raged in his soul. As he watched, he noticed a young boy struggling to carry a large basket of produce. The boy's face was red with exertion, and it was clear that he needed help. Without hesitation, Daniel walked over, reaching out to lift the basket from the boy's hands. "Let me help you with that," Daniel said, his voice gentle. The boy looked up, surprised, but grateful. "Thank you, sir. It's heavier than I thought." Together, they carried the basket to the boy's family's stall at the market. Along the way, Daniel learned that the boy, named Peter, had been helping his mother gather food for the village since his father had passed away the previous year. Daniel felt a pang of empathy as Peter spoke of the challenges he and his mother had faced. "My father used to do all the heavy lifting," Peter said, his voice sad but resigned. "Now it's up to me. It's hard, but I try my best." Daniel nodded, understanding all too well the burden of losing a father. "You're doing a good job, Peter. Your father would be proud." The boy smiled faintly, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Thanks. It's nice to hear that." As they reached the stall, Peter's mother thanked Daniel profusely for his help. He shrugged it off, feeling a strange sense of peace in the simple act of lending a hand. For the first time in a long while, he felt connected to something beyond his own pain. That moment marked the beginning of Daniel's new path. Day by day, he found himself drawn to opportunities to help others. Whether it was assisting an elderly man with his firewood, offering kind words to a woman grieving the loss of her child, or simply listening to a neighbor's troubles, Daniel began to spread light through his actions, though he was unaware of it at the time. The lessons of humility. As Daniel's life shifted from one of internal struggle to one of quiet service, he quickly realized that his newfound path required a lesson in humility. Helping others wasn't always glamorous or easy. Often, it meant doing the smallest, most unnoticed tasks that many would overlook as insignificant. One afternoon, as Daniel was walking past the village church, he saw Father Thomas sweeping the steps. The old priest moved slowly, his back bent with age, but his hands steady on the broom. Daniel approached and offered to take over the task. "Father, let me help you with that," Daniel said, taking the broom from the priest's hands. Father Thomas smiled knowingly. Daniel, always eager to serve. But tell me, what is it you are really learning from these small acts?" Daniel paused, thinking, "I suppose I'm learning to be less focused on myself, to see others and their needs." The priest nodded. "That is true, but there is more to it. These small tasks, sweeping, carrying, listening, they teach us humility. They remind us that no act of service is too small in God's eyes. The greatest among us are those who serve without seeking recognition." Daniel took the priest's words to heart. He realized that in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't about being noticed for his deeds. It was about serving with a pure heart, quietly and faithfully. Over time, he began to find joy in the simple, unnoticed acts of kindness, knowing that even the smallest gesture could make a difference in someone's life. Patience on the journey. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel's spiritual journey deepened. He had learned the value of humility, but another lesson soon presented itself: patience. For all his acts of service, Daniel still found himself yearning for clarity about his purpose. He wanted answers from God, a sign that he was on the right path. But those answers didn't come as quickly as he had hoped. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day, Daniel sat alone by the river that ran through the village. The water flowed gently, its quiet rhythm calming the chaos in his mind. He had been praying for guidance, but felt as though his prayers were met with silence. "Why, God?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. "Why won't you show me what I'm supposed to do? I'm trying to follow you, but it feels like I'm still wandering in the dark." As he sat in the stillness, a memory of Father Thomas's words came back to him. "The chosen ones are not those who are free from struggle. They are the ones who, in the midst of their struggle, continue to seek God." Daniel sighed, realizing that perhaps his impatience was part of the lesson. The journey of faith wasn't about getting all the answers immediately. It was about learning to trust God's timing, even when it didn't align with his own. He closed his eyes, breathing in the cool evening air. "I trust you," he whispered, though his heart still longed for more. "Even when I don't understand, I trust you." In the days that followed, Daniel made a conscious effort to practice patience. He reminded himself that the journey was as important as the destination, and that each day held its own lessons. Slowly, he began to let go of the need for immediate answers, learning to find peace in the waiting. The power of compassion. As Daniel continued to serve his village, he encountered people from all walks of life, each with their own struggles, pains, and joys. He began to realize that, just as he had been shaped by his own suffering, so too had others. His empathy deepened as he listened to their stories, and he found himself moved by a sense of compassion that he hadn't fully understood before. One evening, as the village gathered for a feast, Daniel sat with a group of farmers. Among them was a man named Jacob, known for his quick temper and harsh words. Jacob had always been a difficult person to be around, often lashing out at others in anger. But as Daniel listened to Jacob's story, he learned of the deep pain that lay beneath the man's gruff exterior. His wife had passed away years ago, leaving him to raise their 3 children alone. "She was everything to me," Jacob said, his voice cracking as he spoke. "And now I don't even know who I am without her." Daniel felt a deep sadness for Jacob, but also a stirring of compassion. He realized that Jacob's anger was a mask for his grief, a way of coping with the loss that had shattered his world. Instead of judging him, Daniel reached out with kindness. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been," Daniel said gently. "But you're still here, still caring for your children. That takes strength, Jacob, more than most people realize." Jacob looked at Daniel, surprised by the words. For a moment, the anger in his eyes softened, replaced by something more vulnerable. I don't feel strong," he admitted. "Most days, I feel like I'm barely holding on." Daniel nodded, understanding. "You don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to feel what you're feeling, but know that you're not alone in this. God sees you, and He's with you, even in your darkest moments." The 2 men sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Daniel didn't offer solutions or try to fix Jacob's pain. Instead, he simply sat with him, offering his presence and understanding. It was a moment of quiet compassion, a reminder that sometimes the greatest gift we can give others is to simply be there for them, spreading the light of Christ. As Daniel's compassion deepened, so too did his understanding of what it meant to be a light for others. He didn't need to preach or perform grand gestures. His actions, humble, patient, and compassionate, spoke louder than words. Through his service, people began to notice a change in him, though Daniel himself remained unaware of the quiet impact he was having. One day, as Daniel was helping repair the roof of a neighbor's house, a woman approached him. She had been watching him from afar for some time, moved by the way he had dedicated himself to helping those in need. "You've been a blessing to this village, Daniel," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know if you realize it, but you've brought a sense of peace to so many of us. It's like you carry the light of Christ with you." Daniel paused, taken aback by her words. He had never thought of himself that way. He was just a man trying to make sense of his own journey, trying to serve in the small ways he could. But hearing her speak, he realized that perhaps Father Thomas had been right all along. Perhaps his suffering had been preparing him for something greater. The woman's words stayed with him as he walked home that evening. He didn't feel like a chosen one, or a beacon of light, but in that moment, he understood that the light of Christ wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about walking in faith, even when the path was unclear. It was about showing love and compassion, even when the world felt dark. As the sun set over the village, Daniel smiled to himself. He still had much to learn, and his journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He was exactly where he needed to be, walking the path that God had set before him, one step at a time. Chapter 5. Spiritual Awakening. As the seasons changed, so too did Daniel's journey of faith. What began as a simple quest for meaning had blossomed into something far deeper, a spiritual awakening that touched every corner of his life. His days were no longer marked by confusion or sorrow, but by a quiet, steady sense of purpose. He moved through the world with a newfound peace, his heart open to whatever God placed before him. Yet with this awakening came new trials, tests that would challenge Daniel's faith in ways he had not anticipated. Daniel found that his path often brought him into contact with people searching for more than physical help. Many of the villagers were burdened with spiritual and emotional turmoil, though they rarely spoke of it openly. But there were those who, sensing something different in Daniel, approached him for guidance. Though he felt unworthy of such a role, Daniel soon realized that God was using him to help others on their spiritual journeys. One afternoon, as Daniel was sitting outside the village church, a young woman named Sarah approached him. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with worry. She sat beside him, fidgeting with the edge of her shawl, as if searching for the right words. "Daniel," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who else to talk to. I've been praying, but it feels like God isn't listening." Daniel turned to her, giving her his full attention. He had heard similar sentiments from others in the village, and he understood all too well the pain of feeling distant from God. "Tell me what's on your heart, Sarah. Sometimes just speaking it aloud can bring clarity." She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "My father is very ill. We've done everything we can, but he isn't getting better. I pray for healing, but each day he grows weaker. I don't understand why God would let this happen. It's like he's abandoned us." Daniel's heart ached for her. He could see the weight of her burden, the helplessness that so often accompanied suffering. He remained silent for a moment, searching for the words that might offer comfort. "I won't pretend to have all the answers, Sarah," he said softly, "but I do know this. God hasn't abandoned you. Sometimes it's in the quiet, in the moments when we feel most alone, that God is working in ways we can't see." Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "But why does it have to hurt so much? I try to have faith, but it's so hard to trust when everything is falling apart." Daniel nodded, understanding the depth of her struggle. "It's hard, I know, But faith doesn't mean we won't face pain or hardship. It means trusting that even in our suffering, God is with us, guiding us towards something greater. Your father's illness, it's not a punishment, nor is it a sign that God has turned away. It may be a part of a plan that we can't fully understand right now. He remained silent for a moment, searching for the words that might offer comfort. I won't pretend to have all the answers, Sarah, he said softly, but I do know this. God hasn't abandoned you. Sometimes it's in the quiet, in the moments when we feel most alone, that God is working in ways we can't see. Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. But why does it have to hurt so much? I try to have faith, but it's so hard to trust when everything is falling apart. Daniel nodded, understanding the depth of her struggle. It's hard, I know, but faith doesn't mean we won't face pain or hardship. It means trusting that even in our suffering, God is with us, guiding us towards something greater. Your father's illness, it's not a punishment, nor is it a sign that God has turned away. It may be a part of a plan that we can't fully understand right now. Sarah wiped her eyes, her expression softening. How can I keep believing when I feel so lost? One step at a time, Daniel replied. Faith is a journey, not a destination, and it's okay to have moments of doubt. God is big enough to handle our doubts and fears. What matters is that you keep turning to Him, even when it's hard. Trust that He hears you, even in the silence. As Daniel spoke, he felt a stirring in his own heart, a reminder that the spiritual journey was not one of constant certainty, but of constant surrender. He wasn't offering Sarah empty platitudes. He was sharing the very lessons he had learned through his own struggles, trials of faith. In the weeks that followed, Daniel continued to encounter people like Sarah, people whose faith had been shaken by life's trials. And though he offered them comfort, he too faced his own challenges. For as much as his understanding had deepened, Daniel knew that his faith would continue to be tested. One of the most significant trials came when his closest friend, Matthew, was struck by sudden illness. Matthew had been a constant presence in Daniel's life, a friend who had stood by him through the darkest moments of his grief. When Matthew fell ill, Daniel found himself plunged back into the familiar terrain of worry and fear. The memories of his father's death resurfaced, and Daniel struggled to keep those emotions at bay. One evening, Daniel sat by Matthew's bedside, watching as his friend slept fitfully. Matthew's face was pale, his breathing labored, and the once vibrant man Daniel knew seemed to fade with each passing day. Daniel prayed fervently for his friend's recovery, but with each prayer came the nagging doubt. What if this is God's plan? What if Matthew, like so many others, isn't meant to recover? The thought gnawed at Daniel's heart. He had come to accept that suffering was a part of life, a tool that God used to shape His chosen ones. But now, faced with the potential loss of someone he loved, Daniel found it hard to accept that this, too, might be part of the divine plan. As the days wore on and Matthew's condition worsened, Daniel's prayers became more desperate. He felt a familiar anger rising within him, a bitterness that he hadn't felt since his father's passing. Why, God? Why would you let this happen again? One night, overwhelmed by frustration, Daniel left Matthew's house and walked into the fields that stretched beyond the village. The sky was dark, with only a few stars visible, and the air was thick with the promise of rain. Daniel fell to his knees, his fists clenched in the dirt. God, he cried out, his voice raw with emotion. I don't understand. I've tried to follow your path, to trust in your plan. But this feels like too much. How can I keep believing when it feels like you're taking everything away from me? For a long time, there was only silence. Daniel remained there, on his knees, his heart heavy with sorrow. But as he sat in the quiet, something began to shift within him. A memory came to him, unbidden. Father Thomas's words from their conversation months ago. The chosen ones are not exempt from suffering. It is through their trials that they are refined, made into the people God has called them to be. Suddenly, Daniel understood. His faith was not a shield from pain. It was not a guarantee that those he loved would be spared from suffering. Faith was about surrender, about letting go of his need to control the outcome and trusting that God's plan, though mysterious, was ultimately good. Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he realized the depth of what God was asking of him. He had to release Matthew, to trust that whatever happened, it was part of a larger design. It was not his job to save Matthew. That was in God's hands. His job was to love, to pray, and to trust. With a deep breath, Daniel lifted his face to the sky. "I surrender, Lord," he whispered. "Whatever your will is, I will trust you. Even if it means losing him, I will trust you." Encounters with grace. In the days that followed, something remarkable began to happen. Though Matthew's condition remained unchanged, Daniel found himself filled with an inexplicable sense of peace. The fear and anxiety that had gripped him loosened their hold, replaced by a quiet assurance that God was present, even in this painful season. Word of Daniel's spiritual journey had begun to spread throughout the village, and soon, more people came seeking his counsel. Though he still felt unworthy of such a role, Daniel understood that God was using his experiences, the pain, the doubt, the surrender, to guide others. One evening, as Daniel sat outside his home, a young couple approached him. They were newly married, and their faces were lined with worry. The wife, Margaret, spoke first. "Daniel, we've heard about the peace you've found, even in difficult times. We're struggling with something, and we were hoping you might help us." Daniel nodded, gesturing for them to sit with him. "Of course. Tell me what's troubling you." Margaret glanced at her husband, Thomas, before continuing. "We've been trying to start a family for over a year now, but nothing's happened. We've prayed and prayed, but it feels like God isn't answering." Thomas added, "We're beginning to lose hope. We wonder if we're being punished, or if we're just not meant to have children." Daniel listened carefully, sensing the deep pain behind their words. He had encountered many people in the village who struggled with unfulfilled desires, and each time, the lesson had been the same: surrender. "God's timing is not our own," Daniel said gently. "I understand how hard it is to wait, especially when the thing you desire most seems out of reach. But I've learned that sometimes, the waiting is part of the blessing. It teaches us to trust, to let go of our need for control." Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. "But how can we trust when it feels like we're being denied something so good?" Daniel smiled softly. "Trust isn't about understanding. It's about believing that God's plan is bigger than what we can see. Sometimes, the things we long for don't come in the way we expect, but that doesn't mean God has forgotten us. He's always working, even when it seems like nothing is happening." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "So you're saying we need to surrender? To let go of our desire for a child?" "Surrender doesn't mean giving up on your desires," Daniel explained. "It means conclusion, the fulfillment of destiny." As the years passed, Daniel became known throughout the village and beyond not for his words, but for his quiet acts of love and service. He never sought recognition, never proclaimed himself to be anything more than a humble servant of God. His journey of faith had shaped him into a man who no longer sought answers to the mysteries of life, but accepted them with trust in the divine plan. Through every trial and triumph, he had learned the lessons of humility, patience, and, most of all, love. Daniel's transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, gradual process, one that required him to let go of his own desires and expectations, to surrender to a higher calling that he hadn't fully understood at the beginning. He no longer questioned why certain things had happened in his life. Instead, he accepted that every event, Every person he encountered was part of a greater design. One evening, as Daniel walked through the village, he reflected on the path that had brought him here. The years of struggle and doubt seemed distant now, as if they belonged to another person. But he knew that those experiences had been essential in shaping who he had become. Without them, he wouldn't have understood the depth of God's love or the power of faith to overcome even the darkest moments. As he passed by the village church, Daniel paused. The church had become a symbol of his spiritual journey, a place where he had first sought solace in his grief and later found the strength to continue. He entered the small building, the familiar scent of candles and incense filling the air. The church was empty, save for a few villagers quietly praying at the pews. Daniel knelt before the altar, his heart filled with gratitude. He had come to realize that his destiny was not something grand or dramatic, but rather a life lived in quiet faithfulness. The dreams he once had of making a great impact on the world had faded, replaced by a deeper understanding that true greatness lay in serving others, in being present for those who needed him, and in trusting that God's plan was unfolding in every moment. As he prayed, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. He thought of the many people he had encountered over the years, people like Sarah, Margaret, and Thomas, each of whom had come to him in their time of need. He had not given them miracles or easy answers, but he had walked with them, shared their burdens, and reminded them of the power of faith. Through these encounters, Daniel had come to see that his role was not to change the world, but to be a light in the lives of those around him. And in doing so, he had become a beacon of faith, not through grand gestures, but through the simple, everyday acts of kindness and love that reflected the heart of Christ. The unseen impact. Though Daniel lived a quiet life, his impact was far-reaching. Word of his faith and wisdom spread beyond the village, and people from neighboring towns began to seek him out for counsel. Yet, despite the growing attention, Daniel remained humble, always deflecting praise and pointing others to God. One day, a young man named David came to Daniel, seeking guidance. David was filled with ambition and dreams of doing great things in the world, but he was also struggling with doubts about his purpose. He had heard of Daniel and hoped that the older man could offer him the clarity he sought. David found Daniel working in the fields, tending to the crops alongside other villagers. Despite his reputation as a man of wisdom, Daniel still engaged in the simple, humble tasks that he had always done. When David approached him, Daniel greeted him with a warm smile. "How can I help you, son?" Daniel asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. David hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to express the turmoil he was feeling. "I've heard of your faith," he began, "and I've come to ask for your advice. I feel like I'm meant to do something important with my life, but I don't know what that is. I've prayed, but I haven't received any answers. I'm lost." Daniel looked at the young man, seeing a reflection of his younger self in David's words. He placed a hand on David's shoulder and said, "Your journey is not so different from my own. When I was your age, I, too, thought that my purpose had to be something grand, something that would change the world. But over time, I've learned that our purpose is not always what we expect." David listened intently, eager for any wisdom Daniel could offer. "God's plan for each of us is unique," Daniel continued, "but it's not always about doing something that the world will notice. Sometimes our purpose is to simply love those around us, to be faithful in the small things, and to trust that God is working through us in ways we may never see." David frowned slightly. "But how will I know if I'm fulfilling my purpose?" "You will know by the peace you feel in your heart," Daniel replied. "Purpose is not about what we achieve or how others see us. It's about living in alignment with God's will, trusting that even the smallest acts of kindness and love are part of His greater plan. It's about surrendering our need for recognition and finding joy in the quiet, faithful service to others." David nodded slowly, his heart beginning to grasp the deeper truth in Daniel's words. So, it's not about what I do, but how I live. Exactly, Daniel said with a smile. Our purpose is not found in the titles we hold or the praise we receive. It's found in the way we love, in the way we care for those around us, and in the way we trust God's plan, even when we can't see the full picture. A life of faith. As David left, Daniel reflected on how far he had come in his own journey. He had spent so much of his life searching for meaning, for a sense of purpose that would make sense of the hardships he had endured. But now, he understood that his purpose had always been there, woven into the fabric of his everyday life. His journey had been one of faith, perseverance, and love. It had not been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of anger, and of deep sorrow. But through it all, Daniel had come to see that God was always with him, guiding him, shaping him into the person he was meant to be. In the end, Daniel's destiny was not to become a famous figure or to accomplish great feats. His destiny was to live a life of quiet faithfulness, to be a beacon of light in his community, and to trust that in doing so, he was fulfilling the role God had given him. As the sun set over the village, Daniel stood at the edge of the fields, looking out at the horizon. He felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that his life, though simple, had been rich with meaning. He had loved, he had served, and he had trusted in God's plan. And in the quiet of the evening, Daniel whispered a prayer of gratitude. Thank you, Lord, for guiding me, for showing me that true purpose is found in love, in faith, and in surrendering to your will. With that, Daniel turned and made his way back to the village, his heart full of peace. His journey was not over, but he knew now that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with unwavering faith and the knowledge that he was exactly where God had always intended him to be. In the end, Daniel's story was not one of grand accomplishments, but of quiet, steadfast devotion to the one who had called him. And in that, he had found the fulfillment of his destiny.
If this message resonates with you, hit that like button and let the universe know you're ready for your breakthrough. Subscribe to our channel for more transformative insights and guidance on your journey to abundance. Share this video with friends and family who need to hear this today. Let's amplify our positive energy together. Your engagement not only helps us grow but also strengthens the cosmic energy we are building as a community. Together, we can uplift each other and manifest our dreams into reality, one positive action at a time.